I'm now delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Alastair Denniston, who's Director of the Centre for Regulatory Science and Innovation at the University of Birmingham. Now, after Alastair speaks, we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A, and then we'll have a panel for further discussion. So Professor Alastair Denniston is an expert in the evaluation and regulation of AI health technologies and Director of the Centre for Regulatory Science and Innovation at the University of Birmingham in the UK. He's also a consultant ophthalmologist. Professor Denniston co-leads a research and policy group with Dr. Liu, exploring how we can ensure that AI health technologies are effective, safe and equitable and improve patient care in the real world. Their work includes the landmark Standing Together initiative to tackle AI bias and Consort AI to improve the quality of AI studies. Today, Professor Denniston will discuss artificial healthcare. Are we ready? Do we understand its impact? Is it safe, sustainable and equitable? And what is our role in an AI-facilitated healthcare system? We look forward to examining these questions and even more excited to hear the answers, Alastair. So, hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. As a start, I too would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to thank Helen and the steering committee for inviting myself and Associate Professor Xiaoxuan Liu to join you at this amazing conference. The work I'll be presenting is the program that we lead jointly. So although it might be my name on the slide, I'm presenting on behalf of us both. So, as we think about are we ready, I have a first more sort of fundamental question for you, which is not related just to AI. But essentially, are you an alchemist or a scientist? Now, most of us here, I think probably all of us here, have been brought up as scientists. We're used to that kind of painstaking, methodical, sometimes painful process of trial, error, testing, critical appraisal, open to scrutiny, other people feeding back, looking at our results. But when it comes to AI, I'd put it to you that we're all drawn to become alchemists. We leave science for kind of blind optimism. We try to turn iron into gold. And perhaps most dangerous of all, at the end of that process, when it still looks like iron, we try and persuade ourselves it's perhaps a little bit shinier than before, and try and hold it up to the light in a way that persuades ourselves and others that it might be slightly more gilt than we started with. So hold that in your mind as we think about together about are we ready for AI? I wonder if either of these two statements look familiar to you. The answer to our current health crisis is AI. AI is better than doctors, and we should be using it now. I won't ask for a show of hands, but just think instinctively, are you drawn to this? Does this sound right to you? Or we also hear this. AI is completely different. We're not ready for it, and it's a wild west out there. There are certain terms that you hear in the sort of AI bingo, and Wild West is quite a common one. So Xiao and I were asked to sort of think about this by Lancet Digital Health in the context of responsible and evidence-based AI. And if you're interested, this is a recent perspective from us both, looking at these. So we wondered, why is it that in the context of AI, a new technology in healthcare, why is the conversation so confident and so polarized? Imagine having these kind of statements said about, I don't know, monoclonal antibodies, or proteinase inhibitors, or some other part. But there's something about AI that really draws very strong reactions. And I think we highlighted three areas. One is the vagueness and breadth of the AI promise. We can sort of project onto it all our hopes or even all our fears. Second is the ubiquity of AI in our precognition. What I meant by this was we sort of grow up with the concept of AI, through science fiction. We also have increasingly have it embedded into our kind of into the media, but also into the technologies in our pocket. And we infer from that both our kind of dreams and actually our consumer experience into an entirely different sector. And so when we come to see any evidence, we're already coming with a lot of preconceptions about what it may or may not do. And lastly, perhaps most dangerous of all, is our desperation in a healthcare crisis. And the promise, particularly I think for our political leaders, the promise of 24/7 high-quality healthcare is very, very attractive. And reducing our dependence on those very frail and imperfect health components called humans is indeed also very attractive. And it's this context that can draw even kind of quite experienced scientists into slightly more alchemist-type thinking. So as we're going to look at our approach and how the community is trying to develop a responsible and evidence-based approach to AI in healthcare, we'll look at the whole kind of progression from kind of design all the way through to implementation. But we'll just focus, for the purpose of this talk, we'll look at some brief pointers in 4 areas or 4 gaps that I think needs to be bridged as we think about what this looks like from a scientific perspective for it to be responsible and to ensure that AI in healthcare is indeed safe, effective, and equitable. So we look at the evidence gap, the fairness gap, the implementation gap, and the kind of wider, ecosystem gap. We have a small but brilliant team based in Birmingham, UK, led by myself and Xiao, and we work with gatekeepers around the world, including what partner we work with quite a lot is the TGA here, and also work with the AAHMS Centre down the road with Melissa McCradden, who we'll hear from in the next session. So, I mean, you might say, well, actually, this should be a very short talk because it's already too late. So some of you will be aware, but there's already 950 devices, AI-based devices, approved by the FDA. And when I last looked, there's 120 market-approved devices by the TGA here. So they are there, they're available for purchase, they're available for deployment, and many of you may already be involved in using these in your hospitals and health systems. But the reason why I think it's still worth having this talk is actually we're all gatekeepers. Everybody in this room, wherever you sit in the system, you actually do have a voice in how AI, whether it's patient-facing or kind of back office, whether it's for your personal use or in your kind of professional capacity, you have a voice and a choice in this. And so I think the principles that we'll be touching on, hopefully, are applicable to all of you. So first of all, first one, the evidence gap. So these are kind of familiar headlines. The media loves the AI story, especially in health. And actually, these headlines came from a big project that Xiao led about 5 years ago now. And generally, the main theme was AI is as good as doctors, or one of our tabloids, The Sun, wanted to go one better and said, well, AI is better than doctors. But we liked that one because the headline was, yes, we scan, which we thought was cool. So the actual paper was a systematic review and meta-analysis looking at all studies, all our global studies, looking at deep learning compared to humans in a diagnostics tasks based on imaging. And essentially, there were 2 key findings. The first was that in well-designed studies across a range of tasks, deep learning could indeed match humans, healthcare professionals, for analysis of the same image set against a diagnostic classification. So in that sense, the headlines were correct. But there was, the second and perhaps more important finding was that of more than 20,000 studies identified, there was only a very small number that were actually provided data suitable for meta-analysis and where they performed an external validation. So the trouble with AI, as many of you will know, is if you train it on a data set and basically then test it back on the data sets or a subset of that same data set, it will perform well. But the moment that you take that into a different setting, a different hospital, a different population group, the performance falls off a cliff. So this external validation is doing it at least once, and ideally beyond that, is really important. And so the kind of stronger headline finding for us was that actually fewer than 1% of these studies that was informing all the headlines on a daily basis were actually the sort of studies that actually any of us in the room could put dependence on, and critically that policymakers and the people leading our hospitals could rely on to make good decisions. And we highlighted a number of areas that were of particular concern that maybe either would always be true of studies that you would want to see and that were just being kind of ignored in the context of AI, but we also looked to see are there specific areas that actually in an AI study that people need to look for. And some of these would be around, for example, the selection of data. We often find this true of all studies, that you can have a kind of biased selection of data and you present the cases in which it worked, and for example, the AI technology, the cases where it just came up with a computer says no answer were just being ignored, and really it was only the subset where the algorithm appeared to function that would appear in your final analysis. So we identified a number of areas where you just need to look more closely in a AI-based study, and we took that forward because it's not enough just to do studies and publish. I mean, everybody in this room knows that. You know, that's the easy bit. It's the kind of critical analysis, iterative approach that goes all the way through to impact and changing things on the ground and actually making a difference for the patients we serve. So, again, Xiao led a really important program called Spirit AI and Consort AI program. And we reached out to people all around the world to try and bridge this evidence gap in the context of AI and to highlight, we couldn't fix everything, obviously, but we chose one area, which is to try and enhance the reporting. So trying to ensure that there were reporting guidelines that were suitable for studies of AI health technologies. So again, many of you will know, but the sort of reporting guidelines international consortium is called Equator. They led the first Consort study, which is obviously the precedent for this. And we worked with them to develop extensions for Consort. So this is for reporting your randomized clinical trial, but also Spirit, which is for reporting your protocol ahead of time. And the reporting guidelines you can look up and provide references on some of the slides. But again, what we've tried to do is break down step by step of the report, what should be contained and what might be the blind spots that you, whether you're an investigator leading these studies, whether you're a reviewer, whether you're a journal editor, or even if you're a policymaker looking after the paper's been published, you can see what are the sort of the gaps. Has everything been reported? Reporting guidelines don't tell you exactly what you need to do. They do tell you what you need to report so that people can see what you did. I think partly because of the nature that this was the first of reporting guidelines in the context of AI, and because of the fact that this was the Consort extension, we were delighted to have it widely published and reported, including in Nature Medicine, BMJ, and Lancet Digital Health. And more important than just having it out there, what we saw was that it started to change things on the ground, so that many of the leading journals in the world now adopt Consort AI and Spirit AI as their either mandating or recommended for any studies of those areas. And what we've always tried to do is work slightly right to left in our program of work. So think from the beginning, who are the gatekeepers? Who will enable change to happen? And then have them in the room really from the design stage onwards. And one of the joys of that program was that we had the regulators and the journal editors in the room for that whole process, from systematic review, scoping, Delphi, and then the consensus meeting. And because not every AI evaluation is a randomized controlled trial, since that time, actually, there have been a number of other reporting guidelines that look out for specific context for your use of AI health technologies. So I guess my take-home message from this part of the talk is that think about when you're seeing evidence being presented to you for a particular technology, don't go by the PowerPoint, obviously. Go by the scientific evidence, but also if you're not familiar with kind of every nuance of machine learning, actually, it usually doesn't matter. the scientific principles are the same for any intervention. And if you need some sort of specifics to make sure you're not missing blind spots, then use these reporting guidelines. And as I say, the consult AI is a kind of archetype of that, and it will show you where the kind of potential risks are. There is, however, even beyond the evidence, there is increasing awareness of the fairness gap and AI bias, not just in health. You know, we see this all the time. They're headlines on a daily basis. But what does this look like for health? Well, what's the evidence say? Well, there are some really important studies coming out, and these are just a handful. So, for example, predicting acute kidney injury, a really widespread algorithm embedded within EHR systems was found that the model performed pretty well in men, but performs significantly worse in women. So that's in terms of male versus female, but what about racial and ethnic biases? Well, again, there's a big study showing that an algorithm that was used to predict healthcare need and therefore provide access to healthcare was significantly disadvantaging Black Americans. So this was, again, something being used by health insurers in the US, and actually superficially, it looked rational, but then when you actually unpick the data, you found that because of the way that different groups use the health system, actually what was happening was it was perpetuating and amplifying bias. And we've also found that various diagnostics that you might think, well, you know, of course they'll just work the same for everyone, like chest X-ray diagnostics. Actually, when you look under the hood, you find that actually there is a differential performance in different groups. And again, if we roll this out at scale, we are basically amplifying bias across society. So bias can come into AI kind of really anywhere from concept and priority setting all the way through to kind of post-deployment. Again, we've not tried to address every area, but we've focused on one area in particular, which we'll touch on today, which is around data considerations. And what we've done through a series of systematic reviews, and not just of the medical literature, but also effectively global searches of Google and search engines, is identifying data sets that either are currently being used for development of AI or are publicly available and therefore potentially much more accessible and amenable to that. And what you find is that actually these resources, and perhaps this is no surprise, but you know, we needed somebody to sort of do that mapping exercise, is that these data sets are poorly diverse. They only represent certain parts of the world, often the more affluent ones. The consent and ethics are not usually reported in those studies or those databases, so it's hard to always know what the provenance of the data is and the sort of public and patient involvement with it. But also, key demographics are not reported. And so not only do we have potentially data sets that are perhaps poorly representative of the kind of rich diversity of our populations, but actually we don't even know who's in those data sets. So there's kind of, by inference, you will assume that it's probably mainly representing the majority population, but actually it's really hard to even kind of purposefully look to see whether kind of underrepresented groups are there and how an algorithm performs in those people. We coined the term health data poverty to describe this. And actually the reason for trying to get a bit of a soundbite term was because we felt this was an important problem that we needed to have something, a sort of lay term that we could talk to kind of politicians and policymakers with. But we define this as the inability for individuals, groups, or populations to benefit from data-driven discoveries and innovations due to insufficient data that are representative of them. And when we come to the panel, I hope that we can touch on this a bit more. So in response to this, we led an initiative called Standing Together to develop standards for data diversity, inclusivity, and for AI generalizability. It was using some experience we'd done in terms of reporting guidelines, but recognizing that this was a rather more nuanced and challenging area. And again, what we did here was to bring information from a wide range of sources, including existing data standards, the work we've done around the systematic reviews, and then to start to build consensus through Delphi process, and then the final consensus meeting, leading to the final recommendations. We are very proud to have contributors from over 58 countries, from 58 countries, including from here, including from Adelaide, in fact. Again, the recommendations themselves are available on datadiversity.org. But the key thing is that there's kind of two sections to them. One is sort of recommendations for dataset builders, and I think many of you in the room will be in that business of building datasets. And these are sort of guidance or, if you like, a checklist of things to think about. They're not to tick off, they're actually to think about in terms of how you build a dataset and how you think about the bias that may be embedded within that. Because there isn't a perfect dataset. You know, we need different datasets for different things. And when it comes to you, it will have already, often that data will have already gone through various transmutations that can aggregate, it can blur, and so our emphasis has always been on transparency. It's not pretending that we can make things perfect. But if we go with transparency, then people can make choice. We can see, okay, we'll use this data set for this application, but we also recognize that there are these limits, and we need to be careful around the edges and the limits of interpretation. And the second set of recommendations is around you're a dataset user, and particularly you're a builder of AI technologies, or you're a regulator looking at how somebody has built their technology. Again, it's around transparency. How can we be sure that the limits of the data-driven technology that's built from this dataset? So this has been widely adopted. In fact, the first regulator to formally adopt it after launch was the TGA, again here, and the MHRA had already signaled that they were going to adopt it. It was cited at the G20 earlier this year, and it's just been something that actually a lot of policy bodies have gone, oh, great, thank you, somebody's done the work around this. We don't claim it's perfect, but it's a really significant stepping stone, we believe, in terms of the responsible use of data in this way. So, two somewhat shorter areas we're going to cover: the implementation post-market gap, and then finally the ecosystem gap, and these are linked. So, in terms of implementation, often AI works very well when it's still in the box, but the moment it gets out of the box and into the world, it's a whole lot different. One of the things is there is an information, well, I wouldn't say a void because there's a lot of information out there, but it's trying to find reliable information is really difficult. So I think as a community, we need to be very aware of where our sources are. And we also need to be careful, particularly as I look around senior leaders in this room, we need to be careful about not just duplicating unnecessarily. So everybody wants to have an AI policy, and there's a danger that we all reinvent things and just create a cloud of noise. So there are resources, and it's worth looking at, okay, who should be the gatekeeper in this context? So for example, in the context of the regulation of AI, there's a lot of things that are said about what regulation of AI should be, but actually let's be aware of what our single source of truth is in the area. So here it would be the TGA. In the UK, we've actually got the regulators working together to try and provide a kind of web resource with all their guidance documents in one place. So knowledge, we need to be really careful about that. How do we disseminate knowledge to the people who need it? And the people who need knowledge around AI is a huge number, perhaps more than most health interventions, if we think about the context of how we deploy these technologies. There's also a need for real-world evaluation, so much more than in drugs, and we recognize that drugs also can behave differently once they're out in the world. AI health technologies are way more sensitive to this, to space, to time, to different populations. So the way we think about this is that there's a kind of in silico evaluation stage. There's what we've increasingly called a translational trial, and that's something that Melissa McCradden and Xiao Lu have been leading on, and sometimes in other contexts are called silent trials or shadow trials, but it was actually feedback from patients and public that suggested this term translational trial. And then beyond that, that's working in silent mode, so actually individual patient care shouldn't have been affected by that, but actually we should be seeing, sometimes we talk about flushing the pipes, we're kind of seeing how it would actually work if humans were using it. Then we need an interventional evaluation. So how does it actually work on the ground in my setting, with my population, with all the kind of chaos that happens in our hospitals around us? Or maybe that's just in the UK. But anyway, it's what we experience. But there's even once it's business as usual, there is a need for ongoing evaluation. So why is this? Well, that kind of very neat, clean in silico evaluation is great for picking up AI errors. So that's often where we get sensitivity and specificity results, and they often look very good. But it's only once we start seeing, for example, in a translational trial, we see humans actually starting to use this, not in a kind of laboratory setting, but in a kind of simulated real-world environment. We start to see, okay, where's the human factors introducing errors and risk? And indeed, just their ability and their knock-on effects and how they work. And then it's only once we're using it for real that we start to see, okay, what are the downstream effects on patients and the harms maybe that we haven't anticipated, changes in the workflow, etc., wider ripple effects across our whole ecosystem. Because as ever, if you change one part of a system, you don't always know quite what the knock-on effects of that are going to be unless you actually do it. There's a second reason why we need real-world evaluation. It's just that when things are presented to you, even in the context of a scientific paper, it's likely to be the best that AI technology will ever perform. So remember, these are, at the moment at least, these are locked algorithms. Yes, they may have updates, but they're not continuously adapting. So, and the publication bias is such that we don't tend to publish bad results. So, and that's even more true when it comes to marketing. So this is the best case scenario that you're seeing. So what happens when you really deploy it? Well, the local performance is almost certainly going to be less. And how much less is really important for you to know. Because one, there's a safety implication. And second, there's a value implication. You know, are you actually getting the value back that you're anticipating? Then there's how it performs in terms of subgroups. Now, one of the things we encourage people to do is deliberately and purposefully look across things like age and demographics and sex to see how different subgroups perform. But there are also unmonitored groups, so there'll be stratifications that we haven't thought of, where actually there is a systematic underperformance of people. So this is why we need to start collecting that data prospectively as just part of business as usual. One of the ways we do this is the medical algorithmic audit. So again, this was a paper. It was actually adapted from a non-health algorithmic audit, but taking basic engineering principles applied to software. And what we did was to look at what would this look like in a healthcare setting. And it's pretty extensive, but so I'm not going to go through all of it now, but again, the paper's there if you'd like to look it up. The bit I wanted to highlight, though, is around error analysis and the sort of testing phase of this. So we would advocate for kind of three areas, and particularly the first two are really, really important, is exploratory error analysis. So this is actually looking at, so where did it go wrong? And it's almost like doing a root cause analysis for each of those areas, because that can tell you a huge amount. If you're starting to see, oh, okay, this is why the algorithm failed in this setting. And remember, algorithms often make inhuman or non-human errors. So the sort of cases that we might find borderline, actually the algorithm might perform fine, but things that seem barn toward to us, the algorithm can spectacularly fail. The other thing is subgroup testing, as we've already mentioned. And then the third area is adversarial testing, which is kind of like, okay, can we break the algorithm? What would it take to break it? And that can be a very useful tool for knowing what are the margins of safety within which I can use it. Because as more than perhaps any other technology, again, once you let this out into your team, into the workforce, it's amazing how people will, of their own ingenuity, try and use these technologies. So this is just an example of a medical algorithmic audit applied to skin cancer triage. And one of the things you'll see is how sorry, I realise I can't signal them both at the same time, but essentially the highlighted coloured bit is around the testing and the actual performance. And what we've done is for AI technologies being deployed within our health institution, we feed this information back on a cyclical basis, a recurrent auditing program, up to the, not to the digital lead, but actually to the chief medical officer. So it's a function of quality of care in our organization. This is not research. This is business as usual. Is this technology safe? And is it working well for everybody? And are we getting the benefits that were anticipated? Last thing around this area around implementation is we're also looking at how do we aggregate that safety data at a sort of global scale? Because if the same technology is being used in multiple settings, there's no point just, Birmingham, UK having its smaller round of safety data and Adelaide having its smaller round of safety data if it's the same technology. So what we've been doing is doing a number of systematic reviews, aggregating both in terms of the medically published literature, but also critically the regulators' databases, including the TGA. And what we're finding is, and it's on the screen here, but FDA, as we know, has most devices out there. And at the time we started the systematic review, it was nearly 900, and they're reporting about 1,400 adverse events so far. The TGA, it's about 13 of the devices have adverse events reported against them. But this is the tip of the iceberg. This represents actually massive underreporting. What this will do is it will give us a bit of a profile on what kind of events we need to be looking out for. But there's a whole lot of misdiagnoses and overdiagnoses happening all the time that's not being reported. As health professionals, we're often bad at reporting even drug-related adverse events. We're terrible at reporting device-related adverse events, and almost never report software-related adverse events. So again, this is something as a take-home message I'd really encourage you to think about. So finally, ecosystem gaps. So we've looked at everything, we've implemented, everything's working great, but is the system connected? And safety is a system-wide issue. So you can't just fix your bit of the system. We need to think more holistically around that. So again, for those who want kind of further reading, there's, I led on this report to the UK government coming up for 2 years now as part of something called the Regulatory Horizons Council, which provides kind of advice around regulatory reform to the UK government. And this took a kind of whole system approach. It was a gap analysis of saying, okay, if we want AI to come through, but we want it to be deployed responsibly, we want to accelerate innovation, but we also want to stay patient-centered and make sure that if this is for the benefit of our citizens, then what do we need to do? And we sort of broke it down to a number of areas. But I think a couple of things I'd highlight again as take-home messages is we need systems that will take the issues around failure to generalize, around bias, around ongoing safety monitoring safely. We also need a plan B. So what happens when you've been deploying this technology quite happily for a year or two, this particular algorithm for this particular company, and then there's suddenly a safety notice and it's withdrawn? Are our systems resilient enough for that? Do we have a plan? Will we even detect that we're getting a safety signal coming through? But as I say, when that signal does come through, can we respond? There's also a program which we're really excited about, being led by Xiao with the NHS in the UK, called the AI Readiness Checklist, which is kind of nicely connected to the theme of this talk. And that's about trying to help health institutions self-assess and to some extent communicate both internally and externally as to their degree of readiness. And this is because, again, we've been seeing that one part of an organization is very gung-ho about the deployment of AI, and exactly the same organization, there's kind of saying no, and there's a real lack of consistency both in the sort of language used and the thinking processes. So, return to our original question, coming to land. So, are we ready for AI? Well, I think it depends, doesn't it? I think we're all gatekeepers, and we all have a choice here. AI is here, but actually, as I said right in the beginning, we all have a choice as to how we use it, and when we use it. Some of you, that would be kind of a choice at an individual level, and others, it may be for the whole country. So these are big decisions. What I would say, though, is if we want to use this exciting technology and make lasting benefit, then you need to be a scientist, not an alchemist. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll move one of these down. Thank you so much, Alastair, for a fabulous presentation. So we now have time for Q&A, and we've got roving microphones around. So please put your hand up with a question. Yes. Lovely. Back there. Thank you.
Alastair, thank you very much. Paul Worley from rural South Australia. One of the big objections to the use of AI in healthcare is patient privacy and where the server is, where the data is moving as part of the AI. What's the perspective, say, in the UK or in other countries in terms of using commercial products which may involve servers in Singapore or Europe or somewhere else? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah. So, by the way, just to say, some of these questions, it may be ones that I'll say, that's a great question. I'm chairing the next panel. Can I pass it to the panel? But so there may be others who spend more time in the data privacy area than I do. But in the UK, essentially, there are rules around where that data can flow to. So it ideally is a UK data bank and doesn't go beyond the UK. But actually, the existing legislation allows it to go into Europe. But you need sort of dispensation to go beyond that, which we sometimes do. But that's the sort of default setting. So your point is well made and is recognised as being an issue. So yeah.
Anyone else? Oh, sorry, yes. Oh, no, over there. Sorry. Hand over there, yeah. Way up, wave. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, Martha Hickey from Melbourne. I'm a gynaecologist, but I sit on the board of Breast Screen, that's our mammographic screening programme. And at the moment, 2 radiologists check every mammogram. And we know from the US data that AI is just as good and much cheaper than using human screening. But our patients tell us that they don't want a machine working out whether or not they've got cancer. So what should we say?
Thanks. So it's really interesting. So the mammography data, again, I would say is it's actually been really hard to get some of the data to really convincingly tell the story. I mean, I take your point about the US data, and what's interesting is when they ran the same study in the UK, and I hesitate to say this, but the UK radiologists actually the humans performed better between the two different countries. So actually the benefit was less clear cut. And I think what we're seeing is that a lot of the stories around AI screening breast cancer, clearly it has a future there, but it's the evidence is not always as clear cut as we'd like. But coming back to your point, I think we have to be really respectful of the kind of wishes of our patients around how they want us to deliver care. There are a whole number of factors that we're trying to balance here, including what's affordable for the health system to do. Again, maybe we'll come back to this in the panel, but Zhao's led a lot of work around public and patient attitudes to AI. But what we often see is that there's big conversations about AI in a generic sense, but what we need is exactly what you described, which is the specific, would I be happy with AI being used for this particular health decision? And we work with a group working in diabetic retinopathy where actually the main concern of the patients and public there was they still wanted to see a human when they came up for their kind of retinal photograph. They didn't really mind who made the kind of grading decision in the background, whether that was a human or a computer, but they really did want to see a human when they came to have their retinal scan.
Any other hands? Yes. Yes, just a microphone here on the second table.
Thanks, Alastair, for a great talk. You mentioned that the quality assurance aspect should be business as usual. So I'm just intrigued about what you see the governance structure within hospitals to be that's going to be able to oversee some of this. Maybe some of that exists already. Is it a chief AI officer or is it a team? Have you seen that develop already in the UK?
So I'm going to be asking something very similar to that to Melissa McCradden in the panel. So is it okay if I just defer that one?
Absolutely.
And if she says something I disagree with, then I'll make that point later. But it's a really important issue, and actually I'm pleased you're raising it. What we are seeing, I think it's fair to say, is parallel evolution of quite a few different systems with different labels and different terms, but with common themes within them.
Yes, here.
Thanks. Hi, Denise O'Connor from Monash University. Thanks for your presentation. I'm just wondering who is responsible for conducting the post-market AI technology surveillance and evaluation, and how can we progress standing together coalition to have the data available to do it in a very timely, efficient way?
Oh, thanks very much. So again, we'll come back to it, but to give an initial answer from our perspective, we work within a very big hospital within the National Health Service in the UK. So our capability to do that post-market surveillance type and work with the company to deliver that is much larger than, say, if you were going to be in a small kind of under-resourced hospital or other healthcare setting. So I think it's quite contextual. I think what we're trying to do, and actually this is partly through the AI readiness checklist, is say, okay, if you want to deploy AI, these are the list of things that or capabilities that you need to have in place in order to do this safely. How you allocate them between different partners, and in this case, the health institution and the company, how you allocate that may vary from setting to setting, but essentially, we would argue that contractual stage, you should be agreeing that with the company from who you're buying the technology, and it should be really clear, okay, this is our responsibility, this is your responsibility, and this is how the data will flow, because also if you have those two doing different bits in isolation and not communicating, you won't have a complete picture. So I think that list of capabilities is the same whichever setting you're in. Otherwise, you're not safe to be deploying these technologies. You can't just deploy and hope. But I'm also really open to the fact that one institution will say, oh, we're doing 99% of this ourselves and we'll only leave 1% to the company. And others will say, no, actually, we need to effectively leave this with the company to do. But they should still see the data so that they have assurance. Yeah.
We did have one at the back there, and then John.
Thank you. Kylie Sproston, I'm the CEO of Bellberry, which is a large network of independent human research ethics committees. Fantastic talk, thank you. And I love lots of what you presented in terms of AI as a medical device. One of the trends that we're seeing, though, is also for the use of AI in the generation of every other element of the research development pathway. So, the promise of AI will build protocols that can guarantee your research outcomes, your recruitment tools, participant information and consent form builders that will, guarantee an output. There's almost an ideological question, I think, about can we actually filter to only get positive research outcomes? And I'm getting to my question, I suppose, which is really, I think there are elements that we're seeing in the research kind of pathway that aren't necessarily transparently labelled as either an AI product or supported by AI in the development of. It's almost like excipients in a manufacturing process, right? where AI tools might have been used to develop products that then go into like protocol or dossiers that then go into a regulatory pathway. And I wonder if you'd put any thought into how to deal with those kind of AI tools.
I love it. And I mean, you will have noticed with that question in mind that I barely touched on generative AI within this talk. That's something we're putting thought into, but don't really have data or work to present to you today. And in the talk, we've tried to present stuff rather than just opinion. We've tried to say, okay, and this is work we've done, so that actually we bring to you some data that you can use in your making your own decisions. I think it's a complex. Sorry, that's a bit of a cop-out, isn't it? It's a complex area. It is going to be difficult because these are shades of grey, unlike most of the kind of like a classic diagnostic, true or false. And as you've just rightly said, there's ripple effects of the use of ChatGPT kind of, and the products we then use that then go on to inform other things. I mean, I've used large language models in the kind of everyday use for generating, first drafts of things. It can be very useful in my experience, for the use of, contextualizing kind of reading age and so on. Most of us in the room probably prefer editing these days rather than writing a first draft, so it can be quite helpful for that. But there are issues around the use of these tools, and I don't just mean the hallucinations that we're kind of all familiar with. And if that's okay, I'll park that, so I'll bring that up in the next panel, because I think that's worthy of more time. But the use of AI within research ethics committees is an interesting one, and both for generating, and there's been a study in the UK recently about using it as a kind of pre-screening tool. What would it look like to reduce the pressure on ethics committees? And that's potentially problematic. Yeah.
And John?
Terrific talk, thank you. Down here.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
That's all right. Are we I'm a simple bloke, as you've probably already figured out, but are we overcomplicating things? I mean, to get a new drug on the market, there's a classical sequence of preclinical and clinical trials, phase 1 to 4, which has evolved over decades. It seems to be doing a pretty good job, unless we're fooling ourselves, and no company wants to deliver a drug that causes harm, of course. Why don't we just apply the same sequence of events to a new AI algorithm or a new bit of kit?
Yeah, so could we just copy and paste the sort of drug development pathway, which we're kind of familiar with? It's a great question, thank you. So there are a number of factors. We touched on a couple of them. One is the speed at which these technologies are coming through compared to a drug development pipeline. One which probably shouldn't be a factor, but practically is the kind of financial resources of the backers. So, drug companies are used to, allowing kind of £1 billion per successful drug on the market. But there are no, even the big tech companies actually don't really build, healthcare products, certainly not medical devices. And they're the only ones that could really afford that kind of level. So resources, time, the issue around this generalizability, that you build an algorithm and then it goes out into the wild and time passes and performance drops, different populations respond differently, etc. Just, again, that cries out for a kind of different way of thinking about it. So there are a number of factors why the traditional model doesn't work. But what I tried to present, one of the slides, was an alternative model for doing that, yeah.
There's a question. There's a micro.
Thank you, Michelle Bookbinder, Monash University. I'm glad you brought up money, and I'm a sceptical person, and post-marketing surveillance done by people with vested interests hasn't gone so well, and so I'm wondering about the same, how much should we trust post-marketing surveillance done by the people who may have vested interests, and where does vested interest come into this?
Yeah, no, thank you. So, again, this I think is where if we can have clarity about what does good look like in that phase, and what are the capabilities that we need in that post-market surveillance, and how we share data between the company and the health institution, then I think we can be maybe more comfortable about allocating some of those responsibilities between us. Say, okay, no, the company is, and the company is also motivated to be building good products that are sustainable in the ecosystem. So nobody wants to build a bad product. At the same time, nobody really likes bad news. So we are all on both sides of the fence, actually. Can I say the health institution is also very motivated to keep it turning around. We don't want to suddenly discover that our technology we've put a lot of effort and money into deploying isn't working well. So I think that's also why you need that reporting to be going up through your quality management system and not through kind of the enthusiasts who have been deploying that. So, but there is, when we've been doing a lot of this auditing, and it's very time and resource intensive. Again, some of that may be automated over time, but there is a cost to this. But that cost needs to be factored in right from the beginning. That's part of the contract. That's part of the value proposition, and that's something we've been trying to advocate more of. Yeah.
Lovely. Rob, you didn't have a question? Yes, Rob. One last question, then we'll move to the panel. I'm going to save my question to the panel. So, Rob. Louder? A bit louder.
One of the problems that affects healthcare is the validity of the data that we're dealing with from publications. So we know there's a lot of research fraud and falsification. And picking that up often depends on mathematical models, looking back on the history of that group,
right.
etc. So to what extent has AI started to help us work out with every paper that we look at the validity of the data there that we then put into our decisions about healthcare?
And that's a great point, and I'm supremely unqualified to answer that very good question, I'm afraid. Clearly, that is a potential use case. Machine learning is what it's supremely good at, is identifying patterns, sometimes things that we can't spot as humans. So, but I don't know anything beyond that. Sorry.
Look, thanks. Can you all join me again? Thank you so much for your generosity in answering that diversity of questions and for a fabulous presentation.